Hi there. It's been an interesting week. Who are the two Democrats that are remaining in the race? That's pretty interesting that they're two old white guys. So even the Democrats could see through the fakery of the other candidates, the elitism of some of the other ones, and they didn't buy into the identity politics. It's actually a pretty good sign. And if you looked at the second Democratic debate, Biden didn't look that bad. I mean, he made his usual gaffes, but he kind of looked a little bit more like the grown-up in the room. That was such a poorly run debate. There was just interruptions, and what you could see with Biden was that he was concise, to the point, and he really looked like the only grown-up on the stage. So I think that helped him. I think that helped him a lot. But that's just temporary. There was, if you watch Biden, he's got some severe cognitive difficulties. And I think that will become more apparent during the rigors of the campaign process. One that I was particularly struck was when he had his wife and his sister on one side. And they showed this over and over again. And a lot of people thought, well, he just got confused. But here was the interesting thing. If you watch that clip where he confused he thought he was pointing to his sister and it was his wife, Jill, is he actually had his head turned. So I thought, what's wrong with his peripheral vision? It's almost like there's something definitely wrong with his brain. Because if you turn to the side, your peripheral vision, you'll see who that person is. So he couldn't process that information. Oh my gosh. And of course he forgets names. It would be embarrassing for the United States if he were president. I mean, clearly, I guess what the Democratic elites or whatever, I guess what they think is they can run the show. He'll just do what they say, sign whatever they want. But nonetheless, he's going to have to meet with people. He's going to have to go to international conferences, meet with leaders. Is he going to confuse their names? I mean, it's just going to be, it would just be embarrassing. Embarrassing. There's no way. People will see that because that's something that American people understand. Almost everybody has some older person in their life that may have cognitive difficulties. They're going to recognize the signs. And this is not to mention all of other Biden's problems. He is not a moderate anymore. You know, he's supposed to be for the working people, no, he's not. He wants the Green New Deal. He would ruin our economy. There's no way. There's no way. Trump is going to win so big. Speaking of our president, just watching him this week, first of all, that town hall he did, I'd never seen him in a town hall format. Oh my God, he was so good. And you could see the crowd loving him. I mean, the people there. There was only one question from an undecided. But he answered it just so well. And he was so at ease with the crowd. And he had humor, humility. It was, I mean, I'm sorry, people. What more do you want in a president? He is the best president you could possibly want in every way, shape, and form. He's a virtuoso. We will never have a president like this again. People will try to be like him, but his skill set and his obvious love for this country and for the people becomes so apparent. And he's getting better and better at this all the time. It was really a pleasure watching. And I watched it on YouTube afterwards. And just the comments in the comment section, people just love him. And You can't watch that and not like this president. You just can't. So, and then the next day, I think it was the next day, I mean, he met with the airline executives, just handling that. And I kept thinking, you couldn't put Biden or even Bernie, you couldn't put Bernie in that situation. They don't know how to do that stuff. Biden maybe at one time could have, but not now. Not now. I mean, he always asks each person to speak. He's so good at what do you need, what's the problems, how are you dealing with this. He's complimentary. He remembers people's names. He always brings everybody else into the conversation. Do you have something you want to say? Just so skillful. And he went to Tennessee after that terrible tornado, toured that, and then went to the CDC, was on camera talking to them. He's so good. I love the way he's handling this whole coronavirus thing. It's perfect. It's a blend of having all kinds of contingency plans, making sure where are the hangups, how do you get the testing, what do you need to do, and yet not creating undue fear, because I think it's overhyped. Until I know people who are dropping dead from it, I'm not going to worry about it. I mean, what if it had just been a variation of a flu? Would people, the fact that it has a different name, is that why they're so scared? I mean, people get scared about strange things. So, I mean, we need to take action. No question we need to take action. But it doesn't warrant that kind of fear. Flu does. Flu is very dangerous. I mean, I had an uncle who died, he was old, but he died of flu a couple of years back, not in 2003. You know, that's a way a lot of people pass away. They get the flu. My brother had a very severe case of the flu, and he's younger than I am. I mean, I think he even had to go to the hospital. It was pretty bad. I mean, he didn't tell me until afterwards, but that's spooky. So the flu is definitely spooky. But anyway, I don't want to get into the coronavirus. That's a self-limiting problem, because the season will go away at some point, and then things will get back sort of to normal. But meanwhile, I think we can do some good here, examine our supply chains for a whole host of things, and also our medical supply chains. So I like everything our president is doing regarding this, 100%. I can't imagine somebody doing a better job than what he's doing and what he's getting the administration to do. I even like something that the guy who's the head of the CDC said on Centers for Disease Control. He said, it really means a lot to us for you coming out here, Mr. President, because, you know, it's a boost, a morale booster, because they work so hard, and it's really, really nice to have the president out there. It means a lot to people to have that kind of national leadership, and President Trump has the energy and the focus and the heart. He really cares about this country. He has the heart to do it. I am in awe of him, frankly. I'm in awe of him. I could never do that. I mean, that's kind of a silly thing to say. Why would I ever do that? But, you know, when I was younger, I thought, what if I could be president someday? I mean, I had all kinds of ambitions. But I would need huge amounts of recovery time. I remember when I was in the Department of Defense or when I had high-powered jobs, I always needed recovery time. I could go full bore, I call it being on, for a while. But then I needed a rest. I needed an emotional rest. I needed to be a hermit for a while, get away from that. The people that can just do it over and over and over again, day in and day out, and be energized by it, God bless him. But President Trump, with his skill set and his heart and his strong, strong desire to do something for this country. And I think that really came out in the town hall. If you have not seen it, you know, you can get it online on YouTube. I highly recommend you watch it. It's just watch him. He's amazing. Okay, I have a quite a few things I want to talk about today. And for those of you who stay to the end, now according to the analytics, there's about 30% of people who watch my video who stay all the way to the end, and I know who you are. I'm going to close with a little story about how I kind of lost my space cadet focus. Now, Duncan McNeil of Scotland, you made a comment, and you said being a space cadet means something different in Scotland. It's not a positive thing. You didn't explain what that was, but I'm curious. But anyway, that's what we used to call people, space cadets. But I guess I can imagine what it is. But I'm going to close with that. A little story from my past for those that are interested. You 30%ers, you. But one of the things I want to talk about today, or mention, is something Ben Shapiro said. I don't always watch Ben Shapiro, but he's a smart guy. I like the way he talks fast. It means his neurons, synapses are firing like crazy. He can hardly have his mouth keep up with how fast his brain works. But he said something. He said, because he used to be pretty strong against the whole climate alarmism thing, just kind of dismissing it. But now he seems to be a little bit of a believer. He still doesn't like bad solutions. But I thought, okay, why? And he mentioned Roy Spencer. Now, Roy Spencer is part of the University of Alabama. And he said, Roy Spencer said somewhere that probably 50% of the warming that we have right now is due to human activities. And that apparently influenced Ben Shapiro, that, okay, human activities are causing 50% of the warming. Wow. When you see a figure like 50% or 67% or whatever, you should always be suspicious of that. Where does that come from? One of the things I've noticed, that if you want to play in the game, you've got to have credibility. You can't just say, I don't know if any of it is due to human activities, because you won't get invited to conferences. You'll get dismissed. So I'm of the belief, or a very strong suspicion, that that's why Roy Spencer has adopted that. Because if he has that, it's kind of like, I'm not an alarmist, but I'm a little bit. I do accept the general consensus a bit. Well, I've talked to his colleague, John Christie. In the early days, I had a couple phone conversations with him after I read about him in the New York Times. Very, very nice man, very knowledgeable man. I have the highest respect for him. Anyway, he told me there's no way you can know how much of the warming is due to our emissions. You can't tell. And you can't. I've noticed that since then. So I was reminded of this when I was at the Pentagon. So one of the first things I was tasked with, because of my interview with Bill Perry, for those of you who don't know, I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Command, Control, and Communications. That's the protocol equivalent of a 3.5-star general. I was a high-level senior official at the Pentagon. I was hired by Bill Perry. I had to interview with him. You still have to go through the whole procedure. And when I was being interviewed, he had just recently testified in front of Congress in favor of the Milstar satellite system. This was it was a very expensive, nuclear radiation hardened, very low capacity satellite system. Just a behemoth. And Harold and I, of course, had discussed it many times, what a terrible program this was for the military to be spending its money on. So I was pretty familiar with the Milstar system. And so when I interviewed with Bill Perry, I said, you know, I do have a bit of a problem because I don't think the Milstar is a good satellite system, and you've testified in favor of it. And he said, oh, no, Deborah, I just want them to get the funding because it was an Air Force program. He said, but I'm not necessarily in favor of it. And in fact, when he told me when I came to the Pentagon after he offered me the position, he wanted me to look into it. So when I came, everybody knew that Bill Perry, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, wanted me to look into Milstar. And oh my God, was I ever lobbied like you would not believe. Do you know how many colonels in the Pentagon there are? I do nothing but make, this was 1994, who make, 1993 and 1994, who make, at that time it was PowerPoints, charts, who just go around and defend programs. They're not really doing anything. I mean, the colonels that are out in the field, they're doing great stuff. But there's just way too many of these people at the Pentagon. I was inundated with essentially lobbying. And what was interesting is the Air Force people they were mixed feelings about it because it came out of their budget, but the Army and the Navy would get to use it. You get to use this system. So it didn't cost them anything, so they really, really wanted it. And it was very hard to get good information. I remember one of the top science people at the DISA, Defense Information Systems Agency, he came in to brief me on this, and there was an Army general there watching every word he said, and a couple other people that came to my office. And I'm telling you, they're not free to speak. They were not free to speak. So I had to resort to subterfuge to get some information. So there were two payloads on the satellite. There was the low data rate payload, which was very, very nuclear hardened. And then there was the medium data rate payload, which a little less hardened, but you could at least get more capacity. See, my approach was that this is not going to give the amount of data capacity that you needed. So I said, hypothetically, if you could only have one of these payloads, what would it be? So the really smart DISA guy had to answer that. And he said, well, of course we want both payloads. But I kept pushing. I said, hypothetically. So one of the watchful eye of that Army general was staring at him. He said, well, I can't remember what he said exactly now, but he indicated that you didn't really need the low data rate payload, that it was the medium data rate that would give them more. So that was fun. That was interesting. But one of the things I did do, getting back to the whole Roy Spencer, Ben Shapiro thing, was that there was another satellite system, discus satellite. So I dug this thing out, Defense Daily. This was in February of 1994. Next generation defense satellite communication system, discus satellites. Now these were military satellites, but they were in the X-band. Should be redesigned to focus on theater coverage rather than long-haul strategic links, a senior defense official said February 15th in an interview. Calling the system DoD's workhorse, Deborah Castleman, that's moi, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Command, Control, and Communications, said a discus follow-on should be designed to provide theater coverage using high-power small terminals. And then it goes on and on about what I proposed. And the reason, I don't want to say the reason I did this, but one of the ways everyone knew, that I was like a satellite expert, but I was emphasizing that I wanted adequate, a lot of data capability, capacity for the warfighter. that my concerns with Millstar were that it didn't provide enough, that you were putting a lot of money and expense into something that wasn't going to give the warfighter what they needed. So one of the ways I inoculated myself against criticism, that I'm just like anti-whatever, is by stressing how much I supported high data rate capacity. And that's a protection. So by Roy Spencer saying 50% is due, he's not saying 100%, okay? But he's saying 50%. It kind of gives him credibility. How do I have credibility at Caltech when I go to these meetings? And I indicate that I'm not for climate alarmism, that I'm a climate skeptic, because everybody there knows I love science. I'm usually one of the most prepared people at the meetings. I participate, I'm enthusiastic. Nobody questions my love of science and critical thinking. So that inoculates me to a certain extent. But if you don't have that, it's easier for people to label you. So I thought that was interesting that Ben Shapiro didn't understand why Roy Spencer said that. Because there's no way to know that it's 50%. You know, when somebody says 50%, that's just a wild ass, excuse me, bad language. That's just a wild guess. 50%. There's no way to know that. So anyway, I wanted to say that. And then the other thing is, when you have a book, I mean, I have shelves and shelves of these books, and I've read them over time. But Donna LaFramboise wrote an excellent expose of the IPCC. That's the science body behind the UN, you know, the Paris Accords, everything else. Now, I first heard problems with the IPCC when Harold and I were invited to a climate dynamics workshop at Caltech with JPL people there. And you know, when the IPCC first came out and they had their science bodies, pretty much everybody, even remotely involved in climate science, got involved. But pretty much one by one, they dropped out because they saw it was just a political thing. And you know, it's very apparent. So, I mean, this is all underlined, but let me just give you an example of what, and Donna LaFramboise called this. First of all, this is a terrible, terrible title. I mean, the delinquent teenager, how does that tell you that it's about the IPCC, who was mistaken for the world's top climate expert? When they have these cutesy titles, I just think it's a mistake. But she was a journalist that dug into it, and to her shock, it's like, this information is readily available. But anyway, basically they took science, they did this not to see what's really going on with the climate, but rather to use science to give it credibility. They say, you know, because it's a science. So science has just been horribly used about this. It's not hard to find out about this. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. I really like this 19-year-old gal from Germany, Naomi Seibt, S-E-I-B-T. She's spoken at the Heartland Institute, CPAC 2020, and some call her the anti-Greta. But someone from the audience at CPAC 2020, I was just watching it just before this, I did this video, asked her a question about ocean acidification. Now, to her credit, she didn't try to answer it. That's always a good sign when somebody doesn't BS their way through an answer. To me, you have a lot more credibility if you just say, I don't know enough about that. And that's what she said. But for all of you out there, let me just point out a few things about ocean acidification. Simple things. So if ocean acidification were a problem, then because of CO2 levels in the atmosphere, that would mean that all the ocean organisms that you think would have a problem would have had a worse problem when CO2 levels in the atmosphere were higher, right? When we had the Cambrian explosion, that's when life, multicellular life, really started up. 541 million years ago. There was no life to speak of on land, but there was a lot. It started up in the ocean, big time. The CO2 levels in the atmosphere at that time were 7,000 parts per million. Right now they're like 410, 420 parts per million versus 7,000 parts per million. Now, don't you think there would be a lot of ocean acidification if CO2 in the atmosphere were a problem? How did you have an explosion of life in the oceans if CO2 levels were that high? And then later, when corals came, because it's always about the corals. Really? We've had corals for millions and millions of years when CO2 levels were much higher. So that's why ocean acidification, never worried about that. And also Matt Ridley, I really like Matt Ridley. I read his book, The Rational Optimist, and that was one of the game changers for me that got me thinking differently about all of this. Early on, I think it was 2010 when I read his book. It changed my thinking on a lot of things. But he has pointed out in articles that there's no set level, no pH that's set level. It varies all over the place and goes up and down, up and down. So when you say that the pH levels are going down, by the way, it's not acidic in the oceans. It's more basic already, so it's less basic in some areas. But he said you can't. It's not as straightforward. It'd be like saying there's one temperature in the whole Earth, but actually, temperatures vary all over the place, and so does the pH. It varies locally. And also, I remember reading 2 studies and saving them, but I don't know where they are now, of where it was upped. They put CO2 into maybe a little ocean area, and they put extra CO2 in there. Didn't hurt. Nothing happened to the plants or the corals or whatever it was. So I wouldn't worry about ocean acidification if somebody brings that up. Okay, I can see I'm starting to run out of time, and I want to get to why I'm no longer, apologies to Duncan McNeil, but why I'm no longer a space cadet. So here's what happened. I was working at Hughes Aircraft Company. I was a satellite systems engineer. I had worked in the satellite ground equipment division, which meant I got to travel, and that was really interesting. I spent 3 months in Indonesia. Everything 70 megahertz on up. So I worked on antennas, I worked on low noise amplifiers, I worked on up converters, down converters, power amplifiers. But then I moved to the satellite area, and it was shortly after that I started running into Dr. Rosen, who became my husband later. But after we were married, there was all of a sudden signs that showed up around Hughes saying, we are looking for payload specialists to go up on the shuttle, the space shuttle. Now, what had happened is Hughes had designed all of its communication satellites to be launched from the space shuttle, because NASA at that time had been trying very hard to use the space shuttle as a launch for vehicles. Well, of course, that's a very expensive way to launch vehicles because you have to take care of the people. And whenever you have people in space, the number one priority of that mission is not the equipment, not anything else, it's to preserve human life. So it necessarily becomes super expensive. But NASA was giving a price break So Hughes made its satellites all able to be launched from the shuttle. And kind of as a reward, they were going to offer up a slot for a payload specialist. Now, usually you had mission specialists and you had astronauts, but a payload specialist means the payload is the satellite. And you maybe press a button and it launches it. But I mean, you're not really doing anything. But how exciting. So, you need to be a systems engineer. I remember reading, I thought, oh my gosh, I qualify. And of course, a lot of other people thought they qualified. So I think there were 500 people who put in their applications. And so I put my application in. Oh, I was so excited. And I remember then it went down to 50 because my boss said, he also put his application in, but he said that, oh yeah, they called and, or I had to say you were okay or whatever. And I made it to the cut of 50. So I was very excited. And then they got down to the final 15 and I got to that level. And there were only myself and one other woman. And so I thought if they want to, because they were going to pick two. If they're going to pick a man and a woman, then I have a chance. Oh, I was so excited. I was so excited because remember, I really was a space cadet. And the thought that I would get to go up in space was so, so exciting. So then I had to go in front of a panel. And I remember there was all these people sitting around. And one by one, we went in. And I learned a lot from that experience. I was pretty naive, I think. I talked a lot about how much I wanted to go into space, how cool, and how excited I was, and this and that. And they ended up picking two guys. And first let me say that later I ran into one of the men that had been on the panel. And he told me that he really liked my enthusiasm, but he kind of let me know that I didn't talk enough about how I could benefit Hughes by being up there. And now I realize that whenever you go for an interview, don't talk about just what you want, but how, if that person hires you or takes you on, how are you helping them? So it was great advice. It was great advice. And then another one, the head of the panel, indicated to me that I ran into him and he said, Deborah, there's going to be 11 more slots opening up. NASA has promised us 11 more slots. And I thought, I can get on that. So anyway, the guy they picked, one of the ways in which his background was different than mine was that he had a master's degree in engineering and he'd been a spacecraft manager. Now at Hughes, to be a spacecraft manager means you're responsible for one particular satellite, the end-to-end testing of that satellite in the high bay. That's at Hughes. And that would mean, the vacuum tests, everything, where you test the full satellite and you have a testing. So I applied to Caltech. I went and got my master's. Well, but before that, while I was applying to Caltech, I managed to become a spacecraft manager. I had very good test experience, so I knew hardware, but I'd never been a spacecraft. So I was one of the first 2 women in the company to become a spacecraft manager. And to be responsible for a team, that was a great experience. And I think it was a pretty good spacecraft manager because I really got the team working together. It was a great experience. And then I got into Caltech. And the reason I got into Caltech was because I really, really had good grades in my undergraduate at Cal Poly. And mainly because, as a female, it's like, you have to study all the time. You have to feel like you have to be better. So I studied constantly, and I pretty much got straight A's. So anyway, I became a spacecraft man, and I vividly remember the day. I had come home from Caltech, because I took that school year off, because I got a stipend, and I got a phone call from Harold at work. And he said, January 28th, 1986, that the Challenger exploded. And Greg Jarvis, who had been the person picked, was killed. So, I'm glad they didn't pick me. Life is interesting that way. And after that, NASA said no more satellites. No, you know, they're not going to have commercial satellites anymore. So that was a big financial hit for Hughes. Anyway, I'm way over today. Well, way over, 5 minutes over. But that's why, nah. You never know. Thanks, bye.